Welcome everyone. It's our great pleasure to have with us again Swami Tyagananda ji from our Vedanta Center in Boston. Swamiji has been closely connected with our center for many, many years. You went to Boston in 1998. It was just a year after we started our center here. And whenever I see Swami Tyagananda ji, I remember our temple opening. And he did the main puja for the temple opening here. So I always have that beautiful association. So tonight will be the beginning of a weekend program that Swamiji will speak on the essentials, basics of spiritual life. And it'll be an hour session tonight. And there may be some chance for questions. If not, there'll be a whole question and answer session tomorrow afternoon at 4. The main talk will be in the morning, 11 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. And then 4 o'clock to 5, question and answer session. And we'll serve lunch to everyone also after the talk tomorrow. And then there'll be a break from 5 o'clock until the tea break, until we have our Arati at 6:30. And then at 7:30 there'll be a violin concert. It's Milandra Aikar and Debu Nayak on tabla. Very fine, both very fine musicians. They've both been here before. So I will request Swamiji to speak to us, and then everyone is invited for supper afterwards in the basement. Come on. And for those of you out there in the computer land, we haven't been able to get the focus just on here, so we apologize for that. The remote isn't working somehow, but they'll still see you and hear you.
Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Peace, peace, peace. Very happy to be here with you all, and as Swami Atmagyaranandaji said, this shrine, this temple has a special place in the heart. Although Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother and Swamiji are present in every temple wherever they are enshrined, but if we have prayed and worshipped in any temple, then somehow the presence of the Divine in that place becomes a little bit more palpable. And so I'm very grateful to Swami Atmagyaranandaji for inviting me to be a part of this 25-year celebration. It's a landmark in the long life of an organization, of an ashram like this. And it's so encouraging, so I feel so happy to see a thriving, lively spiritual community here. And through Ramakrishna and Mother's grace, surely this will keep on thriving and increasing more and more, bringing light and enlightenment to more and more people. So very happy to be again with you all. So what I thought would be a topic worth reflecting on is the basics of spiritual life. I am sure many of you, this may not be by no means most of us here might see ourselves as beginners in spiritual life. Perhaps many of you have been connected with a place of worship, connected with the center for years, maybe for decades. And some, of course, may be relatively new. But irrespective of whether we have been practicing spiritual life for a shorter or a greater period of time, going back to the basics, at least occasionally, always helps. I learned this lesson in a strange sort of way. When I came to this country 24 years ago, I didn't know any driving. And so one of our senior devotees in Boston, name was Joseph Dwyer, and you know him, you know Joe Dwyer. So he was my first teacher. So we had a retreat in a place called Marshfield on the way to Cape Cod, and he took care of the property there. And so in summer when I went there, he gave me my first lessons. And I'm very grateful for what he taught. Later on, I also went to a driving school and got some more tips. So Joseph, or Joe as we called him, one day told me that he had been driving, of course, he said from his teenage years, so he had been driving for 50 years by that time. But he said every winter, after the first snow, he does go to the local parking lot in a mall, and he says, I just drive around in the parking lot just to get used to driving in snow. Because no matter how experienced a driver we may be, the rules of driving in snow and the rules of driving on a non-wintry days are a little bit different. How we apply brakes and so on, how we turn. And so what he wanted to say was that irrespective of the experience we might have, it's still helpful to go back to the basics. And that struck me, and that lesson remained with me. And I thought that's not necessarily limited only to driving. It can be applied to every aspect of our life. Because sometimes, with time, we may either forget the basics or ignore them. There was one disciple of Swami Vivekananda. His name was Swami Achalananda. He was also known as Kedar Baba. I have not seen him. He passed away in the early 60s. So I heard this story from other Swamis who had met him. And what they said was that whenever they went to pay their respects to him, one question he would ask. He would speak in Bengali to those who were Bengali, then he would say, Mone ache, which really means, do you remember? Now, those who had used to go to him often knew what that meant. But if you are like the first time you go to meet an elderly Swami and the first question, do you remember? And the question is, remember what? And what he meant for monastic members when they went, like, do you remember in the sense that first time that spirit of renunciation came upon you and the reason you left all other supports and took refuge in a monastery. Do you remember that time? And in a generic sort of way, that question can apply to all of us, whether or not we are monastics. As spiritual seekers, we know that there is something that brought us to spiritual life. Yes, in a general sort of way, most of us are good people, we believe in God, and so on. That's good. A general sort of religiosity is not what I'm referring to. there's something in our life which made the presence of religion or spirituality more than simply occasionally visiting a temple or just on some festival days. There's something in our life which made us take spiritual life more seriously, take it to heart. Maybe, again, it can vary from person to person. It could be sometimes some book that we read, or some holy person that we met, or maybe some event that occurred in our life. The triggers can be really any, and we may not always be able to know the exact moment that we suddenly became spiritual. Some sudden conversions are possible, but in most cases, it's very gradual, very subtle. But we know, if we think back at when suddenly spiritual lives appeared to become more and more important to us, and then maybe we started finding our nourishment from some place, usually an ashram, and if you're a Vedantist, then from some Vedanta center, or meeting with some Swami or some teacher. And we might be able to remember those early days, that spirit, that longing to know, that longing to dedicate ourselves to a higher ideal, to pursue a higher ideal, to take God more seriously. And then we start reading more books, we start attending more programs, more lectures, more retreats, more singing, and all that is very wonderful. But it also happens, as we might have seen either in our own lives or in the lives of our friends and others, that sometimes when we become part of a community, being a part of a community, a spiritual community, has a lot of blessings. We get a chance to live in the company of people who share our ideals, and so it can be a great support to us, absolutely. But also, it's not as if in a community everyone has become enlightened. Obviously not. We come here in order to become enlightened. And so we come with our own biases, our own prejudices, our own angularities of the mind. And sometimes we do see, if we are not very vigilant, if we are not very mindful, then in any kind of a collective endeavor, groups can form. There can be some kind of a local politics. There can't be gossiping. It could be anything. And apparently all of this can begin in a very harmless, innocent sort of way. And that can, without our own consciously knowing it, dilute our initial longing, dilute our initial that pull towards the spiritual life. Our mind might get distracted, diverted by many other things. And therefore, even if we have been practicing spiritual life for a long time, it is very helpful to go back to the basics, just to make sure that the train of our life is still on tracks. We haven't unconsciously taken a detour. It can happen. Actually, I remember maybe more than 20 years ago, I was visiting St. Louis, and after spending a few days there, they also have a branch which is now become a sub-center in Kansas City. And so the assistant Swami there, Swami Swahananda, perhaps some of you may have heard him and seen him. So he was driving me from St. Louis to Kansas City. Just two of us Swamis and just going. And obviously we were having some very animated discussions and stories, and it was fun. After a little while, the Swami said, this road looks a little bit different. I don't remember seeing it this way. Now, I was going for the first time, so it really, I had no way of knowing yes or no. But still we continued driving. And then after some time he says, it really is something very different. And so then we pulled into a gas station, and just looking at our faces, there's one very hefty, burly person at that gas station. He just looked at us and said, "Looks like you guys have lost your way." And we said, "Yeah." And he said, and then we said, "Where are we at present?" And this was pre-GPS. There was no smartphones or anything like that. And so I said, "Where are we?" And then he says, "Welcome to the land of Mark Twain." So we had landed up in Hanover, I think. Hanover, Missouri? What is that place? What is that place which is Mark Twain's birthplace? Hanover, right? Hannibal. Okay, Hannibal. Okay, yeah, I got it wrong. Thank you. So he said, and so what had happened was, while we were talking, unconsciously I had just taken some exit, or I don't know, the road must have turned. But because we were not conscious, we landed up almost like 60 miles off the main track. Luckily for us, we thought we had to take a U-turn and go back, but luckily we didn't have to do that. This person was very helpful, and he showed us the countryside way, so we could kind of go along the smaller the village roads and then connect with the highway later on. So we were delayed by about an hour or hour and a half. And it was good that normally you just kind of drive along an interstate highway and then you really don't get to see much interesting things. So we went along the countryside way, and it was fun. But the point was, because we were not conscious, we had taken a long detour. That kind of a detour can occur in our life as well if you're not conscious. Now, this was kind of good. I'm a fan of Mark Twain. I got to be there and I remember that incident. But all of the detours may not be so interesting. They might bring a lot of pain and suffering in our life. Hence the need to occasionally go to the basics. And one of the ways to begin our going back to the basics would be even to just ask, what is spiritual life? Even those of us who see ourselves as spiritual seekers, it's good to ask ourselves. We may not have a perfect answer, but at least it's good to allow the mind to think and say, what is the meaning of spiritual life? What do I mean when I say I'm a spiritual seeker? What exactly am I seeking? The word spiritual, as with any other word, when you use the word too often, too carelessly, it tends to lose its meaning. We start using it anywhere and everywhere. And the word, something like that may have happened to the word spiritual. So often we see people, you see a beautiful sunrise or sunset. I say, oh, this is so spiritual. Or you read some uplifting poem or some a music that fills your heart with joy. You say, oh, this is so spiritual. I sometimes have problem with that kind of applying the word spiritual everywhere, because just the happy, calm, good state of the mind, it's still a state of the mind. It's still dealing with mind, and it could be either, you could say, psychological, dealing with psychology, the mind. So why spiritual? The word spiritual has the word spirit there. So then that kind of gets to the question of like, what is this spirit? You may have heard that one of the largest growing segments in the country, especially among the younger generation, is what they say, I am spiritual but not religious. Now we kind of understand the sentiment behind it, it's not so much, I think, a rejection of religion per se, but the kind of religion that many of us get exposed to. I mean, religion itself, as it is seen, especially organized religion, hasn't it's covered itself with really glory everywhere. We read in the papers, and unfortunately, that's the kind of things that make headlines and makes news, that we read about scandals and politics and corruption in places of worship. And one can understand why one would be disillusioned by the way religion is being marketed and practiced today. And therefore say, no, I want to have nothing to do with religion, but I'm spiritual. What it ends up being is, well, if I'm not religious, what makes me spiritual? And then oftentimes I've had a chance to speak with many people who identify themselves as spiritual but not religious. And I ask them, what is your idea of spirit? And they really don't have anything intelligible to say. What it ends up being is that I don't want any rules and restrictions imposed upon me by any old tradition or any place of worship. I don't want anyone to tell me what I should do, how I should do it. I don't want anyone to set disciplinary rules for my own life. I'm a free being. I will do what I feel is right. And so, this kind of a personal spirituality, if done well, it can be very helpful. But oftentimes what it means is, what I like, what I'm comfortable with, I kind of design my own spirituality. And that kind of self-designed spirituality can be problematic if it is not authenticated by people who are actually living that way and passing on that lamp of knowledge from one generation to the next. And therefore, it's helpful to begin when we think of basics is, what do we mean by spirit? One way to think about it is that what is the sorry, there's water here? We'll break it. Okay, all right. One of the ways that one thing that can be kept in mind is that there are at least two basic ways one can begin thinking. One way, and that seems to be more common, is the objective way. And it seems natural that the quest for spirituality may have begun by just looking out and saying, well, we experience the world from the moment we are born, and it's not unnatural or it's understandable that this question may have come from, where did all this come? From where did this world come? How did it come? Who made it? Who designed it? And then that takes us to the ideas about God, the ideas about Creator, because questions about the world come to the mind. And that's the way most religions, I think, begin the religious inquiry. Less often, and definitely, probably more prominently in the Vedantic tradition, a few of these early thinkers took a slightly different approach. Yes, they did ask questions about the world and from where did it come. But some of them paused and said, but who is this person who is asking these questions? Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah. Give me that? Okay. Maybe I should leave it here right in front. I hope, no, I'll better put it here. Leave it it here. So, a few thinkers asked a subjective question that all of these questions we have related to the world, where did it come, when did it start, who made it, they said, but who is this person who is asking all of these questions? So, the inquiry which was projected outward, asking about God and the nature of God, turned inward and asking about the self, the one who is asking the question. And when we look inside, then we say, who is this being? Now, in the Vedanta texts, they see the human personality as primarily, again, I'm not saying anything new that you have not heard, but remember, we are going back to the basics. We see that the human personality is primarily seen as a trichotomous or threefold. The very first thing that comes to mind when we think about ourselves is clearly the body. It's the body that oftentimes gets referred to as me. I can say, now I'm standing here, I'm speaking with you, but what is really standing here is this body. This talking is being done through this instrumentality on this body, and I'm referring to it as I. So clearly, a body is a part of the self. Now, we also know that we are not just the body. I mean, that would be an extremely materialistic view. I mean, there are people who do believe that there is nothing in me other than my body. There are people who forget about accepting the presence of the spirit. There are people who don't believe even in the mind, that there is no such thing as a mind. The brain is all that there is. All the emotions, all the feelings, all the ideas about memory, everything is stored in the brain. And when the body dies, the brain dies, end, period. There's nothing. No rebirth, no nothing. That's it. So there are a few people. But most people, I think, do accept that we are not just flesh and bones, that there is something more within us. And then that invisible part of our personality, sometimes we just generically call it the mind. The word that is used in the Vedanta texts is actually antakarana. Anta means inner. Karana is the instrument. So a better way to describe this invisible part of my personality is inner instrument. And by implication, the body becomes an outer instrument. Now, using the word instrument is not by accident, it's deliberate. Because when you think of an instrument, then there has to be someone using that instrument. Clearly, there is something else in my me besides the body and the mind. While today there is physiology and psychology, the two sciences are independent, but they are also connected. We know that our body is affected by things that are happening in the mind. If the mind is extremely stressed and worried and so on, it has its effect on the body. And conversely, if the body is undergoing some extreme changes, then that affects the mind as well. And the reason the body and mind are able to act and interact upon each other is that they both are material. They both are products of matter. If you come to think about it, there is not much difference between the body and the mind. Both need nourishment. Both can fall sick. Both have their doctors. If you put junk in the body, you fall sick. If you put junk in the mind can fall sick. pretty much everything that happens with the body can happen with the mind. Except that you can see the body, it's a very tangible part. You cannot see the mind the way we see the body. But just because we can't see the mind, that doesn't make the mind any spiritual. It's still material. We don't see an isolated electron for that matter, but that doesn't make an electron spiritual. And because the body and the mind both are material, in Sanskrit they use the word jada, they act and interact. And that's why I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not a specialist in medicine, but in medicine they do say increasingly the majority of the illnesses that we have are psychosomatic in nature, that there is an element of the body and the mind both are involved in most illnesses. The third, the body and mind both are instruments, according to the nomenclature that we have. The third part of our personality is the spirit. The word that is used in the Gita and the Upanishads and other books is simply Atman. And Atman simply means the self, me, I. Now the Atman is the only non-material part of my personality. So in one sense we could say at present I'm a mixture, so to speak. If the two mix, they won't, but a combination, if you like, of a material part and a non-material part. The body, mind, material, the self or the Atman, non-material. The Atman, the nature of the Atman is consciousness, awareness. The body and the mind do feel aware, as if they have consciousness, but the consciousness that is manifesting through the body and the mind does not belong to the body and the mind. It's the light of the Atman that is shining through the body and the mind. And in some people it shines more, in some people it shines less, depending on the metaphorical transparency that is generated by the kind of life people lead. You might remember, not everyone can see this transparency. Sri Ramakrishna could. You might remember there is an incident when once Rakhal, Swami Ramananda, Rakhal, he just comes and I don't remember exactly what had happened, but Sri Ramakrishna says, there's something, he sees a kind of a darker shade and he says, no, there's something. So he was able to see when the transparency increased or decreased. So the body, mind and spirit. So right now, we are all of these three. The question that can get asked is, when I think of myself, who am I really? Am I all these three or one of these three or who? And the answer we get in the book says, I'm the spirit. Period. Well, if I'm the spirit, then what happens to the body and the mind? And the body and the mind, we're told, are only coverings. Just the way the cloth covers my body, the body and the mind cover the Atman. Just as, and that's exactly the example that is given in the Gita. Vasamsi jirinani yatha vihaya, and so on. The idea is that just as when clothes become old, we discard them, we throw them away, and we can put on new clothes. Exactly in the same way, when the body gets old, it can be discarded and put on a new body. And that's how the ideas about birth and rebirth and so on they come. So the coverings keep on changing, but the Atman, the inner self, remains constant. So being spiritual means inquiring about the meaning of spirit. So what is spiritual striving? So when we speak about sadhana, what are we striving for? What are we trying to attain? There is no one definitive answer to that question. It all depends on we are trying to attain what we have lost. And why we lost it or how we lost it. Every religious tradition has a story behind it. One thing probably is common to across religious traditions is that we feel that somehow our present state is a degeneration from some earlier state. That things at one time were ideal, they were pure, they were perfect, and somehow now they are not. And this idea can manifest in many different ways. In Vedantic traditions and allied tradition, they speak about the golden age, the Satya Yuga, and now we are in Kali Yuga. So things have kind of gotten bad. And we even hear it from our parents and grandparents. Oh, in the good old days, it was like this. And everyone keeps on saying things are becoming worse and worse and worse. Just as it can happen externally in society, it can also happen internally. And that is what seems to have happened. So why did it happen? Now I said different traditions have these different stories behind it. Now one of the stories we are already familiar with is the biblical story. The story about why the fall occurred, why the degeneration occurred. And that's how that takes us to the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit, the act of disobedience, and then how Adam and Eve were cast off from that island. That's how the fall began. I referred to Mark Twain earlier, as I remembered just now. And in one place, in one of Mark Twain's books, he said, God did not know human psychology. Because he says, Adam did not eat the apple for the apple's sake. Adam ate the apple because he was told not to eat it. Because that's our nature. We're told not to do something, then that was the first thing we do it. So Mark Twain says, God did not know human psychology. He didn't realize that Adam ate the apple not because he liked it, but because he was told not to. If God had only told the serpent not to eat the fruit, then the problem would have been solved, he said. So there is this story about the fall, the biblical story. So we know why the fall occurred if we follow that story. And the cause given is the act of disobedience. And therefore the primary practice in that tradition, although might get expressed in different ways, become obedience to God. That these are the Lord's commandments, obey them. Because look where disobedience brought you. So now if we want to reverse the course, we must start obeying. So what our sadhana is depends on what is the story that resonates with our head and heart. There is not just one perfect story. Every story is effective, every story is useful, every story has produced people who are enlightened and illumined. But because people are different, it's good that we have many stories. Otherwise, if one story doesn't fit us, then we're like, well, I have nowhere else to go. But luckily for us now, we have choices. So we have a chance to know different stories and see, oh, this makes sense to us. There is this one incident in Swamiji, when he was here, Swami Vivekananda. So he was, I forget exactly where it happened and when it happened, but somewhere on the West Coast probably. So he said, there was a kind of a conversation or a talk Swamiji was giving, and he made a remark. And then someone from the audience gets up and says, Swami, what you said makes no sense to me. And then Swamiji said, Madam, it was not meant for you. And then someone else said, but it makes perfect sense to me. And Swami said, it was meant for you. So the idea is, not every teaching is going to resonate with everyone. It is not meant to be. But certain stories, certain ways of looking, certain ways of thinking would say, this makes sense. Well, it might leave somebody cold. That's okay. So among these stories, whichever story resonates with our head and heart, and we follow then its implications, then that leads us to our sadhana. So what is the story that Vedanta puts before us? And it's a rather radical story. And what they said is that, yes, the fall did occur, a degeneration did occur, and then said, but not really. Now, this is very strange that a degeneration occurs, but not really. And yet you feel that you are degenerated. And then that's how we come to the idea that is taught in Vedanta about adhyaropa, ajnana, ignorance. How things may not change, but might appear to change. The classical example, as most of you are aware, is the rope and snake. If you mistake a rope in a semi-lit room, a coiled rope, and mistake it to be a snake, then nothing really has changed. The rope has always been the rope. But because I'm not able to see it clearly, I see it as a snake, and then it brings up fear and tension and all of the things. And that snake would continue to be real to me until I know that it's not real, until I switch on the light and know that it's not real. So there need not be any real change, but there could be, because of ignorance, because of lack of clarity, I could suffer. And that's what Vedantic position is, that the spirit, the books tell us, is infinite, is pure, is perfect, is immortal. Right now, our experience is just the opposite. We don't feel infinite, we don't feel pure, we don't feel perfect. We feel extremely conscious of our mortality. So, how did this change from immortality to mortality occur? And the Vedantic story is that it didn't really happen. That I'm not seeing things clearly. And if I'm not seeing things clearly, if that's the story that somehow resonates with me, then my striving would be to make a conscious effort to start seeing things clearly. And so that then produces or gives us the method, gives us the practice to follow. The sadhana comes from how we define or how we interpret what the problem is and how to solve the problem. Now, ignorance. Now, sometimes people are confused. Sometimes we ourselves might be confused. Sometimes we ourselves may not remember. Why is ignorance, how do we know that ignorance is the cause? And Swamiji, in among the first talks he gave at the Parliament of Religions, he did come to that. He said, how did this happen? How did this infinite become finite? How did this immortal become mortal? And then Swamiji says, the Hindu is bold. He says, I do not know. And no, when you say I do not know, essentially what you're saying, I'm ignorant. So, ignorance makes what is impossible at least seem possible. A rope can never turn into a snake. But if I'm ignorant that it's a rope, it becomes a snake. Not really, but seemingly. Exactly in the same way, this infinite being who is pure and perfect, because of ignorance, has begun to see itself as a mortal human creature. So we are not really human beings trying to be divine. We are divine beings who are acting as if we are human. And we have forgotten that we are acting. I mean, that's the hallmark of a good actor, to forget that you're acting. You're going to pour yourself into the character that you're playing. You know, about the Shakespeare's all the world's a stage. He kind of says all the different stages. So in some sense, we could think about it, that's a very helpful scenario, really helpful way of thinking, that we are divine beings and we have been now given this role to play as a human being. And not just human, we are not just human beings. Within that we have got our own, I could be this, I could be that. So there's all these different layers of the character that I'm playing. Now if I'm a good actor, then I will completely forget my true identity and put myself into the role. And I'll be successful. I'll be a successful actor. And if I'm a successful actor, then I will get more roles to play. People would want me to act more and more and more. So the goal in spiritual life is really to become a bad actor. Because who is a bad actor? Let's say a millionaire takes interest in acting and he is told to play the role of a homeless person. And if that person never forgets I'm a millionaire, then that acting as a homeless poor person is not going to be natural, because the actions, the word, everything will not match with the character person is playing. And people will say, no, that's horrible acting, that's so artificial. Throw this person out. And this person will say, no more roles, and go. What Vedanta might want us to do is to become bad actors. We have become exceptionally good at being human, and we have forgotten we are divine, and we get more roles. We are born again and again, playing different roles, and happy with it. Not quite happy, but forgotten. So we have to become bad actors in that sense. So the first thing to do, so this is the problem. The problem is ignorance, and I need to solve that problem. So the first thing to do, if someone doesn't know something, then they have to be told what they don't know. And therefore, there are essentially only 3 basic practices. If you again follow the Vedantic way of thinking. The first practice is simply called Shravana, hearing. Because if I don't know something, then I must hear what the truth is. Because I've forgotten the truth, I'm ignorant of the truth, someone has to tell me. In the olden days, there weren't any schools to go to, so the student had to physically go to the teacher's house and stay there and learn. So the hearing occurred in that way. And luckily for us, today, there are many more avenues to learn. We don't necessarily physically have to go. Well, even this particular talk now, well, some of you are physically present here. There are many others who are watching it sitting in their homes remotely. So it's possible for them to hear what's occurring here, even if they are not physically present. But we can also hear from recordings, from podcasts, from any number of ways to hear the truth. Now, ideally speaking, if someone doesn't know something, and someone tells them what it is, the problem should be solved. So, if we have never been told, or if we have never really had an opportunity to know that you are this infinite being, you are the Atman, you are not just the body and mind. And yes, there are people who have never been told this. You know about these verses that occur both in the Upanishads and the Gita. Shravanaya pi bahubhiryo na lapyaha, shrunvanto pi bahavo yamna vidyuhu, and so on. That is, there are many people who haven't had even a chance to hear this truth. And there are some others who have a chance to hear it, but it made no sense to them. And there are some others who it made sense to them, and they strive to experience it, and then they maybe advance a little bit and have to keep on striving. But there are a few who get a chance to listen to it, who strive for it, with perseverance, with intensity, and then they experience the truth. The statistics are not that encouraging, really. If you see, even in the Gita, when it says, Manushyanam sahasreshu kaschit yatati siddhaye yatatam api siddhanam kaschinmyo veti tattvataha, that thousands of people may strive for it, but among those thousands, maybe hardly a few might ever come, and among those few, maybe someone might become enlightened. Now, it's possible to just give up the fight and say, oh, this is just too difficult. Actually, think about it this way. There is a greater probability of you being enlightened than winning the lottery. Even though the probability is so less, people don't stop buying lottery tickets. But sometimes like, oh, this is so difficult, this needs so much sadhana, I don't have time for it, I've got so many other things to attend to, and people don't even want to try. Actually, Swami Brahmanandaji one place said, he said, people spend so much time and energy trying to achieve these worldly goals and so on. But he said, realizing God is much easier than that. Think about it. How much time and energy we expend in pursuing different goals in life. Not that I'm not saying you stop doing it, but give a thought to this, that at any moment, all of this can end. It's just like you are in the midst of a dream, and the moment you wake up, everything disappears. Now, we would like to live as long as we can. That's what every human being wants. But really speaking, we have to accept the possibility that we could die any moment. We don't even have to be ill. We don't even have to be suffering. We don't have to be old. Young people die. Apparently healthy people die. So death can occur at any moment. Now, if it occurs, then whatever time and energy I've invested in my hundreds of different plans, everything just wiped out. So think about it this way. When I was studying in India in school, we had a lesson in Hindi, when we were studying Hindi. And one of the essay in that book, I'll first say it in Hindi and then I'll translate it. That essay was titled Marna, Ek Kala, Ek Chance. Death, an art or a chance. And one of the statements in it was such a fascinating essay, little essay, that I remember some of those statements verbatim. Even today, it's like after 60 years later. So, one place it was said, क्या आपको नहीं लगता कि वह आदमी अधिक बुद्धिमान है जो आसमान से तारे तोड़ने का प्रोग्राम बनाने के बजाय पेड़ से आम तोड़ने का प्रोग्राम बनाए? But don't you think that person is more intelligent rather than making a plan to pluck stars from the heavens, has a plan to pluck mangoes from a tree? The idea is this. We plan, all of us make plans, and planning is not a bad thing. It is really good to be thinking about the future and planning for it. But we know from our own experience that many of the things that we plan for don't really happen. Or at least don't happen the way we thought they would happen. Many things don't even occur at all. But there is one thing in our life which will definitely happen, absolutely happen. That is, we are going to die one day. So just as we make plans for other things in life, things that may or may not happen, do we have any plan for this one thing that absolutely will happen? So while we make other plans, let us also have a plan for this, that when death appears before me, will I be crying? Will I be taken away, what do you say, reluctantly kicking and screaming? Or will I say, okay, you are here, let's go? So hearing the truth and planning for it is important. Now, very briefly, we don't have much time, so I'll finish it in the next 5 minutes or so. If the student is ready, then as soon as the student is told, you are the Atman, you are not human, you are divine, that person says, oh, this is something I didn't know, I am divine. And not just kind of say I am divine, not just intellectually appreciate the idea, but actually experience it. I am the Infinite One. For that person, there is no further striving. The problem is solved. But for many of us, we might hear the truth, and yet the problem may not be solved. In fact, those of us who have been coming to Vedanta for such a long time, reading about it, hearing about it again and again, you are this, you are this, you are this, and then we again just go out within 5 minutes, and we are completely gone back to being just a stupid human being again. And so the reason for that is, one of the obstacles is called asambhavana. Asambhavana means doubt. So there are something that might make sense intellectually, say, oh, that's a great idea. But how do I know it's true? Just because some book says it? I don't see any enlightened people moving around me. Am I just hypnotizing me with this idea? So these kind of questions and doubts come. When these kind of doubts come, then the teacher says, now reflect upon it. And that's called manana. So, if the problem is not solved by simply hearing the truth, the next step therefore is reflection, manana. And so the books say that the Uttama Adhikari, the highest category of student, the problem is solved as soon as the student hears from the teacher, Tattvamasi, you are that infinite being. And the student at once says, Aham Brahmasmi, I am that infinite being. Solved. Done. Nothing more to do. But to the moderate or the middling student, the average student, doubts come. And then they have to keep on reflecting on it. Now it's possible that as a result of deep reflection, many of these doubts will get resolved. And when the doubts are resolved, some of these students might become enlightened. Because there were a few doubts, the doubts are completely resolved, they realize Aham Brahmasmi, problem is solved. Nothing more to do. But again, in some cases, they might reflect, doubts may go, and yet they may not be enlightened. And so sometimes in Sanskrit, they call it Kanishtha Adhikari, those who are below average. In short, all of us. Maybe some of you are not. But so if the problem is not solved even after reflection, because a different kind of obstacle comes, and that is sometimes called in the books as Viparita Bhavana. That is, intellectually, okay, I don't have any doubts now, it all makes sense. But in spite of knowing I am Brahman, I am the Infinite One, I don't feel I am Infinite One. I still continue to feel I am this mortal human being. So, in spite of intellectually understanding and appreciating the truth, it hasn't become a lived reality of my life. And then the teacher says, meditate on it. That's called nididhyasana. And as a result of deep exploration in the nature of the self, a deep exploration of this truth, deep down inside our heart, then this obstacle will go away and the person will become enlightened. So these are some of the basics that we can think about when we start thinking about, clearly I'm not speaking about spiritual life in a very broad canvas. I'm primarily focusing it on the way it is seen in the Vedanta tradition. So tomorrow what we could do is kind of delve a little bit deeper into how these practices of Shravan, Manan and Nididhyasan, or hearing, reflection and meditation, what are the different forms they take, how to make ourselves more and more fit to practice these basic disciplines. These are some of the things we'll try to reflect on when we meet tomorrow morning. So I'll conclude with a prayer now. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu.
So everyone will be anxious to hear the main talk tomorrow morning. The question and answer session, we'll have paper and pens here for people to write out questions. It'll be a little easier when we get to that. So you can think of things tonight or tomorrow morning also during his talk. And maybe we can check with chat things for other people and do that. So thank you, Maharaj. Very nice start to the weekend program. And everyone, please join us in the basement now for dinner.